What is the evidence that demonic realm is real? Can demons read our minds? Is there a difference between demon oppression and demonic possession? Well, my guest today is a good friend, and he's the author of Playing with Fire, Billy Hallowell, a journalist. You bring a really unique perspective to this. Love your book. We've talked about it before, but let's jump right in with the big question. As a journalist, what convinces you that demons are real?
As you know, I'm a Christian, right? So I have my Christian response and I have my journalist response. And my journalist response would be, when you look at the evidence of all of the claims collectively over time in every single culture throughout the history of mankind, you walk away with, something's going on there, right? And of course, I'm always very careful when it comes to evidence. You can't always say 100%, but when you've got people, again, across culture sharing in these experiences, and you have faith leaders who have also interacted quite a bit in these realms, it points you toward saying, okay, something, where there's smoke, there's fire, something is happening here. Of course, my Christian response is Scripture tells us this is real, tells us it's true, and gives us quite a bit of information about what this looks like and how it manifests. So there are a lot of different informational points there, but for me, it's the biblical evidence, but then also the experiential evidence that people have had.
That's a great response. For me, I've kind of put it in three buckets. Number one is Scripture, and of course, we have to make a case that Scripture is true and reliable. That's another podcast. Second is just people I've talked with who have seen or experienced the demonic realm. I interviewed Richard Gallagher before, and he shared personal accounts. But also, like you said, the cross-cultural stories from cultures throughout the history of the world of the same kind of characteristics: strength, unknown languages, convulsing bodies that match up with this demonic realm. Those are three ways to look at it. Now, we could probe those in depth, but you, again, in your book, Playing with Fire, you kind of look at these stories as a journalist, obviously Christian, but a journalist. And there's a bunch of stories here. But is there maybe one case that jumps out that was just the most chilling to you that you're not quite sure what to do with?
There are two cases, and we don't have time for me to go into both, but I will tell you the one that I have found incredibly shocking and really compelling is this case out of Gary, Indiana, back in 2011. Her mother, so a mom, a grandma, and a couple of kids living in this rental house. And after they moved into this rental house, they started reporting all sorts of strange things happening, everything from insects swarming, moving into actual possession. The mother believed she had been possessed, that the possession was moving from her into her children. And of course, this was a situation where people were looking at her like she was crazy, right? So she goes to the doctor, she brings her kids into the doctor's office because there's so much erratic behavior going on in the home. And there was some speculation, allegedly, that maybe there was abuse going on or something, and not something demonic, obviously, right? We're looking for that material response, and that's what was happening around her. And so she goes to the doctor's office one day with her kids. And what happens is actually incredible in this office. The kids are acting so erratic, so crazy, that it terrified the doctor. He said he had never seen anything like this in 30 years of practicing medicine. He calls 911. The kids are taken to the hospital. And that's where the situation really sort of expanded into something much bigger. Now, the reason, when you ask the question, what stands out to me, as a Christian, I found this case compelling. But what really stood out to me is that very rarely do you have a situation where people are going on the record publicly. And when I say people, government officials, sheriffs, police officers, obviously the priest who handled this particular exorcism case, the mother did end up going through an exorcism, and others, child service workers going on the record. So when they got to the hospital, and this is the part of the story that makes people laugh, but it's also the most bizarre part. When they get to the hospital, they call CPS in child services, and there is a nurse in the room and also a child service personnel who's taking record of everything that's going on. Again, the assumption was that maybe there was abuse. In this room, this is on official government documentation, okay? I have it in the book. I pulled it up. I read it. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The CPS worker claims that as the grandmother was holding the hand of one of these children who was acting erratically, that the child walked up the side of the wall and essentially did like a somersault and landed on his feet. Now, that sounds like something out of The Exorcist, right? It sounds ridiculous, but that was recorded. And this was such a big story, by the way, that the Indy Star, a well-regarded newspaper, did a major story on this. There was so much, again, not just hearsay, but official government evidence where you had police officers also experiencing things inside the family home. And so it's a very big case. In fact, Netflix bought the rights to it. They're going to be making a movie, so it's going to get the Hollywood treatment.
Wow.
Which might be unfortunate, but
what happens next is witnessed by hospital staff and Child Protective Services case manager Valerie Washington.
So I have the intake officer's report, and this is by Valerie Washington, the family case manager, dated April 23rd, 2012.
Okay.
And this was Valerie Washington that did say, later that evening, he began to growl. He charged at the grandmother's stomach and head-butted her several times.
I said, that's not Andrew, Toya. And he whirled around on the footstool, and he had that evil smile on his face, and I walked up to him, I said, you're not my grandson, you're a demon. When he turned around, he turned backwards, he walked up the wall backwards.
Oh, help him, please! Jesus, help him!
He went up
He
the
took
wall
his
real
feet,
bad.
standing like this, facing the wall this way, and went up the wall, and came back around and stood back in front of her.
What did you do when that happened?
I left the room.
She walked out, I saw her.
That was it, huh? You were done.
Ran out the room.
I saw you go.
So there's the CPS worker right there admitting to the police that's filming this that she did witness this boy walking backwards up the wall.
Who else was in the room when that happened?
The psychologist.
The psychologist was
He
there
was
too.
there. He had just examined
Okay.
Mom.
What did the psychologist say?
He left the room too.
in fact, Netflix bought the rights to it. They're going to be making a movie, so it's going to get the Hollywood treatment.
Wow.
Which might be unfortunate, but yeah. So that case was just wild. Again, as I'm writing the book, I start investigating the case, looking back through, and I'm thinking I'm going to start interviewing people involved in this case, and I am going to find somebody who tells me this is crazy. You know, this family was crazy. This isn't true. But everybody I interviewed backed up and gave me other accounts of things they experienced. So it was a pretty wild case.
This is one of the ones you lay out in your book, and you give documentation and articles that people could go look for themselves. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. You can read it for yourself. You can see the original documentation for yourself.
Here with Billy Hallowell. He works with Pure Flix, is a journalist. He's written a fascinating new book called Playing with Fire, which takes really an honest, sober look at what's the evidence for demons, ghosts, and exorcisms. Now, there's other stories we won't get into right now, but one of the pieces of evidence I found fascinating, I first read in one of my favorite books in the historical Jesus is called The Jesus Legend by Paul Rhodes Eddy and by Greg Boyd. And they were countering this naturalistic worldview, and they said across cultures, in a large percentage of cultures, you find this kind of spirit or demon possession. And there's characteristics like somebody just becoming very violent, entering into a state where later they have no memory of it, becoming very, very strong. What really is the evidence for that, one? And second, in your mind, how significant is that in terms of making a case for the reality of demons?
Yeah, I think it's obviously something that's been studied a lot. And what I think is most fascinating about it is the claim that people can speak languages they don't know. I mean, that to me, because you could say, well, it's just mental illness. And of course, mental illness exists in every culture. But the reality is almost every single culture since the beginning of human history has had these stories, right, of possession, essentially. And they're told in different ways. There are different, elements of those stories. And we even see that today with the contemporary stories. Not every person who's affected seems to be affected the same way. Now, that would cause a critic to say, well, there's not consistencies. Shouldn't this always look the same? Well, no, it shouldn't always look the same. I wouldn't assume it would. Why would we think that? It doesn't always look the same in Scripture when we see the stories. There are different elements. There are different levels to which people are afflicted before Jesus heals them. And so I think for me, when I look at that evidence, I'm saying to myself, okay, there's clearly something going on here. And you have experts who are mental health experts who will look at these cases and will say, I mean, I've had people tell me, and they're not saying this publicly, but they've told me off the record that they work in this field, and I'm not talking about the medical field, I'm talking about the spiritual field, dealing with these issues, and that they will get a call a couple times a year from mental institutions who will say, we have a case, we need you to keep it off the record, and we don't know how to deal with this. Can you come and look?
Wow.
And so what is so interesting to me is that there seems to be a whole community of people in the realm of science, including prominent doctors. I live in New York, here in New York City, who are looking at this issue and saying there's something here. They may not know what they think it is, but there are some, like Richard Gallagher, who are working. I mean, he's a respected psychiatrist, who are working day in and day out trying to solve these issues, working with the Catholic Church and others. So we have a history there to look at. But to me, the most compelling piece is if somebody's speaking a language they've never learned, and they're doing it in an adequate way where it's understandable, I don't know how else you explain that. So that one sticks out to me as very fascinating.
That is a really fascinating point. Now, you mentioned kind of like mental illness and certain professionals and psychiatrists. I want to come back to the question of whether or not this can be explained by mental illness, and clearly speaking a language can't, so that already challenges it. But tell us the story of M. Scott Peck. And I ask because I read his book, The Road Less Traveled in College, thoroughly enjoyed it. He is a Harvard-trained professional, died in 2005. But as far as I understand, he did not claim to believe in demons or Satan. But his last book that he wrote is called Glimpses of the Devil, a psychiatrist's personal account of possession. What on earth convinced a psychiatrist who's used to interpreting what we might call erratic or unexplained behavior by pointing to the brain or some mental illness that there actually is a spiritual realm of demon-like beings?
Yeah, so with M. Scott Peck and others, it's interesting. It's usually this common thread of actually being involved in an exorcism, actually saying, okay, you know what, I'm going to take part. And in his case, there were 2 cases that he took part in, and they convinced him, I mean, that he was actually able to see evil. And so we see this with Dr. Richard Gallagher too. I mean, there are plenty of people who have gone through this in the science realm. They're kind of like, oh, this doesn't exist. I don't believe in this. I'm a doctor. I believe in science. And you're confronted with actually seeing people behave and manifest in ways that you can't explain, whether that's strength that you can't explain, whether that's in some cases, and I don't mean to get away from his story, but I think his is pretty cut and dry. He saw 2 women go through this, and it changed his perspective. But in Gallagher's case, he actually, I mean, it's crazy. He was on a phone call with a priest about this woman that he was trying to help, and he claims that a voice came over the phone and communicated with both him and the priest, and they were 2,000 miles apart. They were 2,000 miles away from each other when this happened, and it was a voice that was threatening them to stay away from her, don't help her. And so you hear, and he's like, I mean, this is somebody who would not make this up, right? He's a well-respected psychiatrist. So there are so many examples of this, and I think with M. Scott Peck, we see that. We see somebody confronting evil, seeing it for what it is, and having to, and thank goodness people are willing to change their perspective to say, okay, there's something going on here.
Did some of the stories that you researched for this kind of surprise you and take you back? Like, there must have been things you didn't expect to uncover in writing a book like this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there were a few things. The one consistency that really disturbed me in talking with a few people who had gone through what they believed was a possession, right? I'm not talking about like a spiritual attack, something minor. I'm talking about a full possession, was this thought that they had in their mind that they wanted to end their life. And it was something that, I don't know why, it was just something about this detail that really stuck with me, and it really freaked me out. And it wasn't just, oh, you know, maybe I should end my life. It was, you need to end your life. You don't matter. End your life. And it drove at least one of these people to attempt to do that and to obsess over that. And that was a weird consistency. And it shouldn't be that strange to me, because when you read the descriptions of Satan in Scripture, I mean, this is basically to destroy. I mean, this idea of trying to destroy us, that would make sense. But to hear people describe what it was like to slowly go through this process of finding themselves in that state really struck me.
Let's talk about one more piece of evidence for kind of the supernatural realm, which are Ouija boards. And I mean, I know I'm probably like a lot of people where I haven't done a Ouija board. I'm in 6th grade. I had a friend start when I was like, I'm done. Let's not do this. But I can tell you, I have people I know and completely trust that tell me things that had been revealed to them they could not possibly have known, that they verified with other people later on. What do you think is the evidence that there's something to Ouija boards that at least points towards kind of this supernatural realm?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with something like the Ouija board is that critics will say, yeah, but I've used one and I never had a problem. And the vast majority of people might use a Ouija board and they think they're playing a parlor game, it's nothing harmless, and they may have no problem with it. But there are enough people who have actually had life-changing, life-altering issues after using a Ouija board. Some of them I know as well. Some of them are not willing to speak about it. And they have had terrifying things happen in their home, in their lives. Now, here's the thing about the Ouija board, okay? It promises to open a door, right, for you to communicate with the dead. I mean, that's the entire premise. You're trying to communicate with the spirit world. I think that's how they word it in their advertisements. And this became a toy. It became something that we think is fun. Like you were saying, friends will pull it out at a sleepover and everyone's laughing. You're having a good time. Well, some people don't have a very good time after they use it. And so I wanted to go and sort of look at the history of it. Like, what is the history of this thing? Because it's one thing to sort of look at it as this tool that's fun to play with in a board game, but where did it come from? And I had never really thought about that before. And so when I started digging into this sort of mysterious, shrouded history, one of the things that stood out to me, and this is sort of a commentary on the media too, I mean, when you go back to the 1800s and you look at what was going on back then, the New York Times, the Associated Press, these outlets would actually often cover different stories that involve the Ouija board. They would talk about the history of it. They would talk about cases, right? Like, let's say somebody committed a murder and they claim the Ouija board told them to do it. That would be included in the news report. If there was a possession of some sort, the Washington Post covered the story that was the basis of The Exorcist in a news story in the 1940s. So my point is, the media was once open to these things. Now, critics would say, well, yes, everybody, back then they just weren't as astute, they weren't as smart, they weren't as, But I think it's actually fascinating to look back at a time when people were more in tune with the spiritual to see how they communicated about it. So when it comes to the Ouija board, there is a deep history to it. It was actually something that was purportedly created by this woman, Helen Peters. She was a medium, and it was created for the exact purpose of what it's used for as a game, which was to communicate with the dead. And you have a history of people turning to the board, and it was called a talking board. That was initially what it was called, a talking board, until Helen allegedly claimed that the board wanted to be called the Ouija board. So this name apparently came from the board itself, communicating that that's what the name should be. So the long story short of it, there is a very eerie history of this. And the thing that really stuck out to me was this man, William Fuld, who he had created. Now, he had inherited the rights to it. The New York Times at the time in 1929, I believe, 1927 it was, when he died, they called him the creator. He wasn't the creator of it, but he owned a factory where he was producing Ouija boards. And he fell off the top of the factory. He was up replacing a flag, and he died. He fell off of the Ouija board factory and died. And so I was looking at his obituary, which was in the New York Times, and it was describing this incident. And I was just thinking, it's just a strange detail. It's a very shrouded and bizarre history. But I wanted to mention one more thing about the board. During wartime, people who were desperate, right? It sort of preys on the desperation of people, desperate to connect with their deceased loved ones. They would turn to the board in droves. And so throughout history, when things have gotten difficult, when there's been a war or a tough moment, people will often legitimately turn to it to try to find that solace and that peace by connecting with their dead loved ones. So it's got that history to it.
Didn't Fold say that the board told him to build kind of the house and the chimney in the way they did, which led to his death? Did I get that detail right?
So one of the claims is that he believed, and of course, you know, we have things that are documented, right, which is his death. That's documented. One of the claims surrounding his life is that he was told by the board to build that very factory that he fell off of. Yes.
Wow, which would fit what demons do if there's demons behind something like a Ouija board, not necessarily other spirits. Doesn't prove it, but kind of fits the larger narrative that's there. Okay, anything that I missed in terms of evidence you would offer for the reality of demons that I didn't ask you about so far, or is that a pretty good case so far?
You know, I think it's a pretty good case so far. I think one of the things, you know, that just as you're asking this, that comes to mind, and a lot of critics will say this, well, if this is happening, why isn't it so out in the open that everyone can see it and record it on their phones and document it? And one of the responses to that has come from some I've interviewed has been, well, if you are Satan, if you are a demon, if there's evil, why you would want to hide in the shadows? You wouldn't want to be out in front. And so
Sure.
I find that interesting. I think it's compelling. I think some would say it's a cop-out on this issue, but I had people saying to me, don't write this book. You're giving attention to something you shouldn't be giving attention to. And my thought is the opposite. My thought is we're not talking about this stuff. You don't have to believe this, right? You could think everything that we're talking about here is not true and that this is crazy, but to not have the conversation, especially for Christians, right? When we talk about evidence, especially for Christians, is a very dangerous thing. We are leaving out a massive part of the gospel. And I would also add, and then I will be quiet and let you ask your next question, that if we don't fully understand, and this was my takeaway here, right? One of them, if we don't fully understand evil and what it is, and the Bible is very clear about this, and I just ignored it. I just always glazed over it, read it, kind of knew Satan's bad, obviously, you know. But if we don't understand that, I think that we lack what we need to a degree to fully understand the good. Like, why do we need Jesus? Why do we need Christ? Why do we need any of that? I mean, it points us right back to that. So rather than obsess over the dark and the evil, I think we understand it. We see it for what it is. We see the effect it can have over ourselves and culture, but we're pointed back to truth in that process.
So if it's true that a lot of people say our culture is dominated by naturalism, which explains everything scientifically, which I would argue we see in movies like Stranger Things, which seem to have a demonic realm, but it's all explained by science, then one of the ways to counter this is to show that there is a demonic real realm. And you cover the story in your book about the exorcism and how actually the person who first wrote the book was trying to communicate these stories in a positive way that people would actually believe there's a demonic realm. First off, did I get that right? And second off, what is the story behind the exorcism?
Yeah, I mean, you got it right. So Blatty, the author, he actually thought he was writing like a mystery crime, book. He didn't think he was writing something terrifying, which, because if people don't realize this, The Exorcist, the movie, is based on his book. And so Blatty often spoke about this and said, I didn't even realize I was writing something scary. I thought I had a compelling case of exploring evil, but it was more of a mystery for him. And he was really compelled by this. And what's so interesting about The Exorcist, we talked about the Ammons case, right, out of Indiana. Both of those cases were made public when somebody gave information to a journalist. And that is so interesting to me. So in the case of The Exorcist, in 1948, there was this little boy, Robbie. Now, that's a moniker. We don't know his real name. To this day, Robbie's identity has never been revealed. But Robbie was the basis of that book and of the film. And what happened to him was that he apparently had an aunt, his Aunt Tilly, and she was very into the Ouija board and communicating with spirits, and she had sort of gotten him into that. Tilly dies, and all of a sudden they start having crazy things happen inside their home and inside the family home. The bed is shaking. There's all sorts of things going on. Now, this is according to his family, and they seek help. They seek doctors. They seek anybody they can to help them, and they end up in St. Louis. And they end up seeking help from the Catholic Church. And it's this crazy case of multiple exorcisms over this little boy. And what's different about this case is that there were actually journals kept by the priests who were involved in this. And this was all kept under wraps. But those journals document some of the most horrific and terrifying things you can imagine. Words appearing on his body and disappearing. One of the priests had his nose broken during these violent fits that this kid would go through. And so this kid was healed. Okay, he was a teenager. He ends up being healed. And the Catholic Church assumes this is a closed case. Nobody will ever know about it. Well, somebody leaks it to the Washington Post, and they write a story about it. And William Blatty, that's how this came about. William Blatty read the story, and he heard about it from a college professor of his, and he was captivated by this story of Robbie's ordeal. And so he wrote The Exorcist based on that. And what's so interesting is that years later, somebody shared with him that journal that had been under wraps for all those years. So he had a chance to read it, and it's available. People can read excerpts from this journal. And the priests over the years, and again, this goes back to when you ask, is somebody's story legitimate? If somebody's hesitant to share it, it does give some credence. And those priests always felt like that story should have never been revealed. And to this day, we don't know who he is. This boy did not want his identity revealed, and he'll probably go to the grave without us knowing who he was.
Gosh, that is so fascinating. Well, we are here with Billy Hallowell looking at the evidence for demons, and we've been looking at stories today. We've been looking at cross-cultural evidence. Let me ask you one more question about this, then I want to shift to some of the biblical evidence. We've had some great questions in the comment section that you deal with in the book Playing with Fire, but given all you've researched and all you've seen as a journalist, if you were going to reject this, what route would you take to reject it? Meaning, would you say we just don't know and there has to be an explanation? Would you say it's mental illness? What approach would you take if you were forced to debate the other side?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the mental illness aspects are interesting, but they only go so far, because when you look at what could be explained, only so much of it could be explained by mental illness. Having extra strength, having the ability to speak in another language, not responding to certain things that mental illness would respond to, those are things that we would have to explain away. I think I would have to say, if I was going to take the other approach, it would have to be, well, there's not enough evidence overall. In all of these cases, there's not compelling evidence.
That's interesting. That's very similar to, I think, on the resurrection. It's just kind of a naturalistic bias, doesn't meet the standard of evidence, which means this, like many other issues, really comes back to a question of worldview. Now, when you and I were chatting before, I asked how some of this research kind of affected you, and you shared one story in particular you said that has really just stuck with you. And it was the story of Amy Stamantis, if I said that right. Can you share what that story was and why that has stuck with you so much?
Yeah, when I was researching the book, I was doing a lot of praying, just like, God, lead me to the right people. And I thought, let me just do a Google search. Like, has there been anything in media? And this was last October. And so all of a sudden, I'm Googling exorcism, I'm Googling demons. I'm just curious, like, has anybody covered it? And I noticed this local affiliate in Arkansas, media outlet, had covered this woman, Amy's story. And she's in a wheelchair, I noticed immediately, and I thought that was interesting. And I start reading it, and I decided to reach out to Amy because I was so compelled by what I was reading. But her story starts completely in the most bizarre way. She's a churchgoer. She's somebody who believes she was a Christian. And so this is interesting, going back to what we were talking about before. She at least believed she was. And she was a nurse, successful, working in a hospital. And one day she just didn't feel right. Something did not feel right in her mind. Her body felt off. And so after her shift, she goes home. She tries to go out for a run. She was a marathon runner, and she can't run in a straight line. She goes home to her husband, and she's like, I don't know. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I feel like I'm having a nervous breakdown. And within 8 days from that moment, within 8 days, she was in an institution, a mental institution. They're trying to figure out what's wrong with her. She's losing her mind. She's not behaving normally, completely erratic. And so she goes to the Mayo Clinic. She goes all over the place, trying to get answers, and nobody can give her an answer. They don't know what's wrong with her. Is it physical? Is it mental? And so she's on all sorts of medications. They're not helping. And 8 months goes by. Okay, so flash forward 8 months. She's lost her job. She's not working anymore. And she's got children and a husband, right? So she's got a family. And she goes up to the second floor of her house. And Amy had this idea in her head. It was that idea I mentioned before. She wanted to end her life. She had never been suicidal before. And she just kept feeling like, how do I do it? How do I kill myself? I'm a nurse. Let me think of the ways. And so she goes up to the second floor, and just picture this. She sits in the windowsill. She's facing the inside of her house. So her back is to the open window. And Amy decides 2 stories up not to jump, but to just drop herself out of the window. Okay. That alone, when I was reading it, was terrifying to me. People will jump. She didn't try to break her fall. She just glided down, hits the cement floor, hits the cement ground, and nearly dies. She breaks all of her ribs. She breaks her back. And Amy is now paralyzed. She's paralyzed from the waist down. Now, what happens is she goes to the hospital, obviously almost dying. And a woman goes to this prayer event that Amy's church holds for her. And this woman doesn't know Amy at all, but she feels compelled to visit her in the hospital. And this is a woman who's done deliverance, right? She's been involved in this. And she goes to the hospital, and Amy's talking to her basically in another voice, giving her indications. And the woman says, I could see evil. And this woman's being interviewed in this story too, that this outlet did. And long story short, she prays over her, does a deliverance. And once Amy is cycled off of her medicine, this all ends. She never has another manifestation. She never has another issue. So she goes, just basically a prayer over Amy that this woman does. And now Amy is speaking out. And again, there's reluctancy. Her family doesn't love that she's speaking out. At least they didn't in the beginning. But she's got a compelling story. She has never had another issue again since this happened. So I'm kind of truncating it, but her story really struck me for a lot of reasons. She's in a wheelchair for the rest of her life.
That is powerful. These are not just ideas in books or blogs or movies. That's a real life person experienced this today, and living it out shows how much ideas have consequences and makes a case that the demonic realm is real. Let me ask you a final question I'm curious about. When I was reading Heiser's book on demons, he says we typically think that satanic kind of influence is exorcisms and hauntings. But when you look at Ephesians chapter 6, the first defense that we have is truth. So aren't these some, would you agree with this, that these tend to be more the exceptions, but Satan's normal strategy is just to twist truth and deceive people? Do you agree with that?
100%. And at the end of Playing with Fire, I talk about culture. And I think right now we are looking at a very confused, lost, and you know this, I mean, I follow the work that you do, a culture that is looking for answers in all the wrong places. And when I'm a trained journalist. I've worked in media for years. I've worked around Hollywood for years. And when I look at all the places of learning in this country and in this world, you've got Hollywood, you've got media, you've got schools and universities, and all 3 of those areas. I mean, think about this. Coincidentally, all 3 of them have been dominated by a secular materialistic worldview, and a worldview that has not only been, and I'm generalizing here, but I think most people know that this is the case, that has been damaging to young people, to adults. The ideas that are coming from these arenas are terrifying, and they're harming us. So if you were Satan and you were really trying to confuse people on a mass level, I believe you would do it through culture. I believe you would do it through the day-to-day, the slow churning, changing of people's perceptions through all different means. And so I think that is really the battle that we're facing. And so whether it's politics and how, and anybody who watched the presidential debate probably was like, oh my goodness, what is going on? Politics is downstream from culture. I mean, we have taken our culture and we've allowed it to become what it is. And so I think that is the rule. Right, we are talking about exceptions, and I think we have to be careful how we handle these issues. We need to be aware of them. We need to talk about them. But more importantly, I think we need to understand the impact of not talking about them is actually how we end up, in part, with the culture that we've inherited.
Do you have a sense of why some people might get possessed, but others don't?
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating to me, because after I spent such a concentrated amount of time looking at evil in scripture, right? I mean, as I was writing the book, I was just looking at these portions of the Bible that talked about these issues. And the thing that really stuck out to me in all the New Testament accounts was that we're never told. We sort of meet people where they are. We meet all these people and they're possessed, right? And they're struggling with this, and they're being thrown into fire or thrown into water, or saying crazy things, or they have supernatural strength, and you're wondering, how in the world did they get there? And it almost seems like it was by design, because none of the stories tell us how they became possessed. What was it that led them to that? And so that to me is so interesting, right? That we're not given those blueprints for each of those stories. I mean, you would think one of them you'd be told, right? I mean, but you're not. And so, I think when we look at this, we have to be careful with this, even within scripture, when we start pulling different pieces and putting them together. But I like to look at what we're told not to do. You look back at Deuteronomy, people are told to not engage in witchcraft, not engage in necromancy, not engage in speaking to the dead. All of these things that culture is actually obsessed with right now. They're experiencing this revolution in culture, right? Psychics and all that, tarot cards. Children are doing them at an insane rate, which is disturbing. So you're watching all that happen, but we were told, avoid these things, do not do them, right? And so you see that theme throughout scripture. You also see in Acts 16, the slave woman she's a psychic, right? And she's able, because of the spirits, the demons that are in her, to actually perform those psychic duties. And when Paul heals her, she loses those abilities. So there's so much to unpack there, but we don't actually know why. Now we can say, look, if you open yourself up in some way to evil, and when you talk with experts about this, they will tell you, some will say drug use can lead there. I mean, there's so many different avenues there. So we don't know definitively, but we do know, again, going back to Ephesians 6, what protects us, right? And so the opposite of what protects us would seem to be what opens us, which is a broad answer.
Oh, that's a great answer. I think there's a fair balance in saying we don't know, and we don't want to presume to know and just shame somebody. But we also have to say, on the flip side, the commandments are clear to stay away from this, which seems to presume that we could open ourselves up to such kind of criticism. So keeping those two in balance, I think, is really important and wise. That makes sense. So let me ask you this. I hope it's okay that I ask you this. Is if you're writing, and you did write a book on ghosts and demons and the paranormal, partly my question is what motivated this. But second, have you had an experience where you didn't just read about it as a journalist, where you thought, okay, I've seen this with my own eyes. This is now personal. And I ask because if demons are real, you and I are Christians and believe they are, if someone's going to expose the plan and nature of demons, it would seem to be that person would arguably be a target for some kind of attack. Now, those outside the faith are going to think that's nuts, but if this story is true, it's not. So have you had any kind of experience like that you're comfortable sharing, so to speak?
Absolutely. I've had a number of experiences that I couldn't explain, and I'm always careful with how I frame these things. But one of the stories I haven't talked much about, years before I wrote this book, I would often get assigned stories on this topic, and usually nothing would happen. But there was one particular story where it was an exorcist who it was a priest. I was supposed to interview him, and I was assigned the story. Every time I would call this guy, something would happen. And when I say something, I'm talking about lights going on and off. I mean, very strange things. In our apartment, we had a touch lamp, and we had just had a baby. So our first kid was little, and the touch lamp would go off. So this guy would call me, I'd miss his call, he'd leave me a message, and then these things would start. And of course, I wasn't connecting the dots at first, but the touch lamp would go off. The second night he called me and I missed his call, you know, those battery operated things on the crib that you play for your baby, that went on by itself. You know, we had a series of these events going on. And I was so scared, I'm not going to lie, at the time, not really understanding the dynamic of good and evil, and that Jesus defeats all of this, and we don't need to be afraid as Christians, that I did not do the story. And so when it came time to write this book, I did not want to write this book. I didn't, you know this as a writer, you fill out a proposal, you go through a whole process when you're putting a book together. I didn't give the publisher a full proposal. They saw something very small about the topic, and they offered me the book deal. I sat on it for months. I prayed about it. I did not want to write it because of that fear. So that's a long answer, but I also had some other things happen the day that I was offered the book deal that were also unexplainable. So yeah, I've had a series of strange events, but the minute I really approached this in prayer and stopped being fearful and wrote it because I knew God wanted me to, all of that stopped, and I never had another issue again after that.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. Let's jump into some of the characteristics of demons. A question I get asked frequently when this topic comes up is, can demons read our minds?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I would say no. Demons and Satan cannot read our minds. Can they place ideas in our minds? When you look at Scripture, you look at 1 Kings 8:39, and you look at that, and it says, "For you only know the hearts of all the children of mankind." Speaking about God, right? So when it comes to our hearts, I don't think that the devil can read our mind, but I do think he can read our fruits, right? I think demons see how we behave, what we're doing. They're watchers of humans. And some of this, again, is speculation. You're trying to put the pieces together based on what we know. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence in Scripture that anybody or any entity outside of God can really read what's going on in our hearts.
I agree with that. And I think there's also some good evidence against it, arguably, when you look at things like the dreams with Joseph and with Daniel, and the kind of the magicians and the people that are working for the king or Pharaoh at that time didn't have the ability to read his mind. And it took God to read his dreams, so to speak. So I don't think there's any reason demons can, but you're right. And to me, what really makes it interesting is I studied communications as an undergrad, and we would talk about how the majority of communication is actually nonverbal. It's eye contact, it's head nods, it's smirks, you name it, communicates far more. So if demons are intelligent, we have reason to believe that they are, and they've been doing this a long time. They don't have access to our minds, but they have the second best thing to read what we're thinking, put pieces together, and manipulate from there. So if they can't read our minds, can they put thoughts into our minds, though? Can demons do that?
Yeah, I think they can. I think they can put things in our path. They can cause questions. The things that happen in our lives that often lead us toward very negative things if we allow them to. I definitely think the goal is to separate you from God, right? And when we talk about the attributes of Satan, that's what the goal is. It's to harm you, to kill, to steal, to destroy. When you look at those attributes, I think absolutely evil will try to do anything it can to knock you off course, right? You're on the road, you're going where you should go, and boom, it knocks you over. And I think that does happen. Now, do they talk to you in your mind? I think that's a bigger conversation about possession and all of that. But in general, I think they can put things in your path for sure.
Hey, let me pause for a second. And, sometimes because I'm a professor, I launch into like academic idea mode and forget, straight up what Paul says in Ephesians. We wrestle with flesh and blood, not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers. What might you say to somebody who happened to click on this and has felt oppressed, felt possessed, seen things, and maybe in that fearful state that you were before? Before we continue on, what words of encouragement or theological truth would you say to somebody who's with us and has those fears or concerns?
I love that you asked that, because you brought up Ephesians 6, and that to me is one of the most important pieces of Scripture that I think a lot of us look past. We read it and we move on. It's like, oh, that's great. That piece of Scripture, that bit of Scripture tells us everything we need to know about what is going on, not only in the world around us, but within our own hearts, right? We have this battle, we are in it, and human beings today are looking at everything happening on the news and assuming that everything is material and that's all that's going on, when in reality, we have to see everything through a lens of something broader and bigger. And so when it comes to how do we take what we're told in Ephesians 6, that there is a battle between good and evil, that we are in the middle of that, and that we can't see the wrestling that's going on, but that we have a solution, right? The solution, pick up your shield of faith. It means be a Christian. I'm sitting there afraid to do these stories and write the book, which is so silly now. Jesus is so powerful. We don't have to fear evil. It doesn't mean evil won't exist or be around. It doesn't mean we don't have to be on guard. But when you live your life every day, waking up in prayer, reading Scripture, having that relationship with God, that's how we protect ourselves from this. So we don't need to fear it. It's when we get away from that, right? When we get away from what we're told in Ephesians 6, that's where we leave ourselves open, I think, to problems. Again, it doesn't mean we're not going to struggle. But I think if you're fearful of this, your solution is turn to Jesus. And for me, that was the most eye-opening part of looking at all of this and recognizing there's a battle and we're in it. And how do you win it? Well, you can't win a battle you don't know you're in, right? You can't win a war you don't know you're in. So I love that you brought that up.
So let's ask this one. I get asked this one a lot, especially from students. If demons are defeated and they know their fate, why do they keep hounding believers? Do they not know and they just haven't read the Bible? That seems crazy. Do they think they can win? We just talked about how Scripture says it's clear they can't. So what would be the point?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that theology of salvation really plays into this in a lot of ways, because if you're well, first of all, before I even go there, the goal is to separate people from God, to put stumbling blocks in people's paths, right? And so, there's a big debate about whether or not Christians can be possessed, right? So, and we could talk about that. But I think when you look at this issue, you have a situation essentially where demons are trying to, again, be that wedge. They're trying to step in. If you believe that people can lose their salvation, right? If you believe, okay, if I say, you say the prayer, the salvation prayer, you accept Jesus, you're good for the rest of your life, you don't have to worry about it. If that's my belief, well, then I would say, yeah, like, why would demons even bother? But if you believe that people can be pulled away, you might be more open to the fact that, yeah, like, why wouldn't demons try to take a believer away from the Lord? Why wouldn't they try to put that in their, put something in their path to make them stumble? Because that's the goal, to kill, to steal, and to destroy. And so it's really an intricate, interesting sort of dynamic. And depending on what you believe about salvation, I think that will impact it. But at the end of the day, their goal is to create chaos. That is what they do. That is what we see them doing in Scripture, in people's individual lives when they're impacted. And I think in a lot of ways, we could probably argue that what is going on in culture more broadly is a reflection of that as well, collectively.
That's an interesting point about how someone's theology of salvation would affect how you answer why demons keep fighting. Now, even if you thought that someone could lose their salvation and be dragged away, then Satan still loses. He just loses a little less badly, I guess you could say, in some fashion, but he still loses. So the answer would have to be that just misery loves company, right? Maybe
Absolutely.
It's just, this is what a demon is, and it acts consistently with its nature, almost like an animal. You can't expect a lion to act any differently than its nature. That's, in a sense, what a demon is. So let's talk about Satan for a second. Is Satan also a fallen angel? Who is Satan? What do you think we know about Satan from Scripture?
Yeah, I mean, it seems when we look at the Old Testament, it seems we're being told that obviously Satan is a fallen angel. What I find fascinating about the Old Testament, you have Job, right? You see Satan going up to God, presenting himself before God and accusing Job. And that's really interesting. But there's not like this vast amount of information about Satan in the Old Testament. We get a lot more of him in the New Testament, right? And so that's intriguing to me, and it makes you wonder why God chose to sort of unveil the information over time in that way. But when you look at the attributes of Satan, and that's the most important thing, and I've hinted at a few of them, but he's a liar, right? He steals, he kills, he destroys. You look at 1 John 3:8, the devil's been sinning from the beginning. I mean, that is, sort of wild. You look at Jesus coming to destroy the devil's work. Satan hatches schemes, Ephesians 6:11. You can go down throughout the New Testament and you're given so much description about who he is. He's a tempter. We see that in Matthew 4 and 1 Thessalonians 3. And he's the prince of this world in John 12, which I always find that scripture interesting in light of what is going on in the world today. So there's so much there. He's not a good dude. I guess that's how we would summarize it.
That might be the greatest understatement in the history of my show, that he's not a good dude. We weren't even talking about it. So you're investigating the paranormal, ghosts, demons, etc. But I wonder if Satan's primary strategy is not so much possession, oppression, these dramatic stories we hear about that everyone admits is very few and far between. But Satan's primary strategy is much more subtle and manipulative, and it's, you might just say, a campaign of disinformation. And I think about that because I go back to the garden, and, Satan, in one sense, you have a talking snake, and I've always wondered why Adam and Eve aren't like, what the heck, a talking snake? I mean, that's a whole nother question in itself, but it's like Satan, as the serpent, asks these subtle questions and undermines and just tries to get Adam and Eve to second guess what they think is true. So is probably the primary strategy of Satan just disinformation, however he does so, more so than these oppressions and possessions that pop up now and then.
Absolutely. And I think when we look at our culture and what's going on right now, I mean, look, we've had things are not good, and we know that. But humanity has had a complicated history, so things have not been good lots of times. But I think what's happening now that has never happened before in the history of the world is that these lies that we're talking about, the lie that started in the garden, we're seeing these lies permeate communications, permeate media, permeate Hollywood in a way that you are able to distribute a message to everybody in the world, right? And you're able to do it really easily. And so I think we're seeing an infusion of those lies in the culture. And if I were Satan and I were trying to sway a culture, I wouldn't be wasting my time and energy going around and possessing everybody, right? Or trying to do that. Not that it's not happening. We know it's rare and it happens.
Sure.
But I'd be spending more time, if I knew all this technology existed and all this was happening in culture, trying to get that little lie that started in the garden and distribute it all throughout humanity, convincing people, putting their identity in things they shouldn't be, all the things that we're sort of watching happen right now. And I think it's going to get a little crazier, are actually a part of that. I think we're watching this happen at a 30,000 foot level right now. And it's important to be discerning and to understand that, because that too is part of Ephesians 6, right? And we can't separate that out. We have to look at it and integrate it into our understanding of what's happening.
Billy, you're a great guest, man. You're fun, you're thoughtful, you're engaging, you care about this stuff. We will definitely have you back. I hope people will subscribe to your podcast. And you've suggested a few of the guests for me to interview here, and I really appreciate that. Keep them coming. We'll partner together. Hope folks watching will pick up your book. I think it's great. Billy, you're a good man. Thanks for coming on, my friend.
Thanks for having me.